I'm usually not the biggest fan of older models. Technology has advanced quite a bit and the new sculpts are just superior to the old ones, most of the time.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Phalanx Miniatures. Some of the older models were such standout sculpts though when they came out that even according to today's standards, they are still among the best. So a couple of weeks ago I was going through the pre-orders for Games Workshop, which I definitely don't do religiously every week, and as I was scrolling through the Old World Chaos releases, I came across this upstanding gentleman sitting on his handsome mount and I just reflexively threw my wallet at the screen. Therefore, in today's video I'll be painting the Chaos Lord on his Daemonic mount, mostly following the original color scheme, but trying to go for a slightly darker, more grungy version that is more befitting the follower of Grandfather Nurgle. And I will be using this opportunity to practice something that the original paint job is such a good example of, but I just recently realized. A little twist that I think we can all use to make our models more striking and catch the eye of the observer more. And as usual, I made a 44-page written guide full of pictures and explanations on my Patreon, so in case you want to follow along or just want to support the channel, check the link in the description below. By the way, I was so fast with throwing that wallet that I didn't even realize that this model was metal. This makes it the first metal model I have purchased from Games Workshop, and oh boy was it an interesting experience to put it together. I really have a lot of respect for the people who have been in the hobby since all the models were like this. Us newcomers, we don't know how good we have it with our fancy digitally designed plastics.
But that's enough chatter, let's put some paint on this model and let me show you what I mean by a little twist. And let's start with the green armor and work our way towards even bigger twists as I paint this model.
So, once I finally managed to put it together, I primed the model black, but I didn't want to start painting the armor panels green immediately. Instead, I took a dark reddish-brown color and base coated all the armor with it. And the reason why I'm doing it like this is because I want to add some interesting effect on all the important elements on this model, and in the case of the olive green armor, I want this reddish color in the shadows and around the rivets to make it look rusty and warm. Now this is nothing new in itself, I have painted rusty stuff before, but what I noticed when I was looking at the original box art is that the painter actually did this on everything. Not just the armor, but the weapons, the shield, the horns, the skin of the horse, and so forth. Nothing was just a single color going from dark to bright, everything had a little extra tone or additional effect that made it stand out, and most of the time there was more than one little twist per element. So I decided to try this out as well, practice it and try to build this into my mini painting process. From now on, whenever I look at an element, I'm not just asking what color that thing should be, but also what effects and extra little things I could sneak into it to make the model more interesting and striking. As I paint this model further, you will see how this works in practice. When I covered mostly everything in red, I started painting the green armor with an olive green color. I love the original color scheme, but I didn't want to just mindlessly copy it, and for me, Nurgle has always been around lush saturated colors, not the desaturated official tones Games Workshop uses. But I made sure to leave behind the original reddish rust color in the shadows of the armor and around the rivets. Then, to avoid desaturating my highlights, I started mixing in some light yellow and continued the process by highlighting the edges and the rivets to create lots of definition and little scratches and marks in place of volumetric highlights on the armor. The original color scheme makes him look almost pristine, which is a bit contrary to how I imagine Nurgle worshippers, so I thought that the worn, scratchy and rusty armor will make him properly Nurgly, while also adding that extra little twist I wanted.
When I was reasonably happy with the armor, I moved on to the skin of the Daemonic mount, and once again I asked myself how I can make it a little more interesting than just painting a highlighted brown.
And of course the first thing that comes to mind when painting the skin of a hairy animal like a horse is to add some hair texture, which is the first thing that I did as well. This is actually pretty similar to the method I used on the armor with the scratches, but this time I used longer, thin scratches, and wherever the light would hit the horse more, mostly on the surfaces facing up, I overlapped them more to the point where they created a homogeneous highlight. But in the midtones and to a lesser extent in the shadows, you could still see the individual strands of hair. And hair texture is fine, but I wanted to add a little more. Creating a freehand of a tattoo on a light surface of skin is a great way to make it more interesting, but fortunately for us, this model already provides us with pre-sculpted chaos symbols all over the body of the mount. So naturally I painted these in shaded and highlighted red colors, and later I was planning to add one more effect that the original paint job also had, an orange glow effect around the chaos symbols, but we will get back to that later.
Let's move on to the really interesting bits next and let's paint the metals.
The bronze elements are some of the most striking parts of the original color scheme, so I was a bit apprehensive about doing them. Instead, I started with the steel or iron bits first. Once again, I was asking myself how I could make them more interesting than usual. Some answers are obvious, for example, on a model like this, some rust should be a no-brainer. And since there is a lot of bronze, I could also add some verdigris as well, and both of these were also used in the original color scheme. So I decided that this time I will add something subtle of my own and use greenish tones in the shadow colors for the metals, which especially on the hammer should make it look like it reflects the green armor around it a bit. Aside from the twist, I also had the goal to create relatively dark metals, even if the highlights are bright. I have a tendency to make my non-metallic steel too bright, and this time I wanted to make sure that I kept myself in check. I think I mostly succeeded, although looking back I might have overdone it a little bit on the hammer. So subtle greenish hues in the shadows, check, verdigris effect around the bronze decorations, check, and rust effects in the cracks, check.
That should do for the twist on the steel metallics, so let's move on to the bronze.
The bronze bits, especially the huge demonic face on the shield and the helm of the Chaos Lord, are some of the most striking features of the model, so they really needed to look good. In the past, when I was trying to do bronze metals, my downfall was that I tried to do it with a simple progression of colors going from dark to bright. My colors were mostly correct and my primary light placement might also have been okay, but the end result looked boring, and this paint job will show you exactly why. As you can see, the basis for the non-metallic metal is not really that different from what I usually do for bronze. I go from dark red through orange-brown colors all the way up to white, making sure to highlight all the edges and place the highlights more or less where the light would hit them naturally. And when I was done and I added the final touches with white, the end result looked okay, but not spectacular. Nowadays I usually fix this by adding a secondary light of a different color, like the green glow I had on the Skaven Greyseer in one of the latest videos on the channel. But this time there was no secondary light on any other part of the model, so I used something different, but at the same time also quite similar. First of all, I glazed some dark sea blue into the shadows of the shield, and this actually has a lot of different effects. It deepens the shadows, creating more contrast, and coincidentally, it also smooths out the shadows and the midtones, which is a nice bonus. But it will also serve as the basis for the verdigris effect that you can also see on the original box art. But by glazing it into the midtones, it will look like the verdigris is reflecting on the bronze, similar to the subtle green we did on the steel. Once I was happy with the amount of dark sea blue on the shield, I started adding brighter and brighter blue-green tones into the crevices, building up the verdigris effect. When I was happy with the verdigris, I added back some of the highest highlights that I obscured a little with the darker color. And finally, I took a very thin glaze of orange and glazed it into the midtones to bring back the color I lost along the way. This last one is a tiny step that takes only 1-2 minutes, but it really adds a ton to the end result, so it shouldn't be skipped.
With the metals done, let's move on to the horns, and there are actually a lot of these on the model, all around the horse, the shoulders, and the head of the rider and the shield. Which means that these also warrant some twists to make them more interesting to look at.
When you make low effort horns, you might just paint them in a light color, then add a little shade, dragging it towards the bottom if you are feeling extra fancy, and then adding a little highlight on the tip. So how can we make them more interesting? Well, the first thing is to designate one end of the horn as dark and the other one as light, but since there are so many horns, it would look a little boring if all of them followed the same pattern. So instead I highlighted all the curved ones from the midpoint up, whereas all the straight ones got highlighted down towards their base. When I established the highlights, I did the same thing with the shadows, but in the opposite direction. I took some Rhinox hide and I glazed it at the bottom half of the curved horns towards the base, but on the straight ones I painted it towards the tip. I used 2-3 coats of this, with every successive one going on a smaller surface, closer and closer where I wanted the horn to be the darkest. And when I couldn't go any darker, I mixed in a little black to create even more contrast between the darkest and the lightest end of the horns. Okay, this was a good start, but we are not finished yet. There is a nice transition on the horns, and it is even different among the curved and the straight ones, but the colors are boring. So I thinned down some Mornfang brown and glazed it right in the middle of the horns where the two colors meet. This adds a whole new, more saturated color into the horns and makes them look much more interesting. Finally, I took some of the original highlight color and added a little white to make it brighter and painted some of the grain onto the horns. If you look at the box art, you can see these lines running alongside the length of the horns following their curve. In the end, I didn't do as good of a job as the painter who did the box art, but even like this, they add even more detail to the horns. So transitions from dark to light in different directions, multiple color transitions, and more or less free-handed grain on the horns. That should do the trick.
Alright, at this point we did already a lot of complicated elements that required some sprucing up. Before I did the last one, I needed to paint in a lot of smaller things that were not important enough to warrant any effects or tricks.
Like the cape and fur around the Chaos Lord's shoulder, the tail of the mount, some of the wooden elements, and the only clear indication that he has the touch of the grandfather, the tentacle that serves as his left arm holding the shield. Now there was only one more twist that I still needed to do, the glow effect around the chaos symbols on the skin of the horse. But before I started working on it, I improved the symbols with some orangish edge highlights to improve the definition and to tie them together with the orange glow I intended to paint. Then I started the glow effect by painting some white marks around the edge of the symbols on the skin of the horse. In most places I wasn't trying to make them entirely continuous lines, rather trying to create some broken lines and dots that still follow the curve of the symbols. In some places I made the marks more faint, and in some others I added multiple coats fully covering with the white. When I was done, I took some orange fluorescent ink and simply painted multiple coats over the lines, but also a little around them, until the white parts were fully covered and were properly glowing. Now I only needed to paint the base and add some grass stuffs to it. Of course, I couldn't resist adding various colors. And with that, the model was finished and the end result looks like this. I don't think I've ever added more little effects on a single model, and it was a really interesting exercise, but I learned a lot from this, and in the future I will keep an eye out for more opportunities to add little twists to my models. And who knows, maybe after having watched this, you will too.
I hope you guys found this video useful, and if you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And if you want to have a more in-depth look at what I did here and what paints I use, there is a written guide on my Patreon, so check that out. Thanks a lot for watching and for your support. See you in the next one.